Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel promoting mindful communication, growth through conflict. Please subscribe if you want to keep updated with the different videos that I'm producing about communication and conflict related issues. And also check out the channel if you want to see some of the past videos that have been produced. So today's video is the third in the series about mediation. So I've been a mediator for 23 years and a conflict coach, and I train mediators and conflict coaches. And the first two videos were about how mediation helps people to resolve their conflict. And the second video was about what does a mediator do and why. So check out those videos if you want to see what goes under those headings. And today the third video in the series is about what happens in mediation meetings and why. So if you were going to have mediation, or if you're going to have mediation with me or other people trained by me, today's video will be about what will happen in the different meetings that you have. So there are two types of meeting. One is what's called the Initial Mediation Meeting, where the mediator meets with people individually to help them talk through the situation, but I'll go into more detail about that in a second. And the other type of meeting is the Joint Mediation Meeting, where people come together to discuss the difficulties that they're having with each other or about a situation or both. So again, I'll go through the detail of what is involved in that meeting and how it's structured later in the video. So that's what today's about. I hope you find it useful. As I've said before, what I can only describe what I do as a mediator. You will find that some mediators practice differently, but the aim of my videos is to explain what I do, how a mediation meeting is structured, and why things are done in the way that I describe. So the reasoning behind it, so that you can understand why things would happen as they do, whether that's because you want to have mediation with us or whether you are interested in training to be a mediator with us. Hopefully it will be of interest to you from whatever perspective you're coming to things. So I'll see you on the other side of this, and I hope you enjoy. So first of all, I'll talk about the Initial Mediation Meeting, which is where I would meet with people separately, the people involved in the mediation. There may be two, usually it's two, but sometimes there may be four, sometimes it may be up to 15 or so if it's a group mediation. But I'd meet each person individually in what's called the Initial Mediation Meeting. And that involves, from my perspective, that involves three different things. But from the perspective of the person I'm meeting, hopefully it's just to help them to consider what's involved in mediation and whether it's something they'd like to go through with, and to answer any questions they have about it. But for me, it's for three reasons. First one is to hear the person's view of the situation and how it's affecting them and what they'd like from mediation. Secondly, it's to explain to them what a joint mediation meeting would involve, so how it's structured, what its purpose is, and to answer any questions they have about the joint mediation meeting, hopefully to reassure them about any concerns they have. Usually when I talk it through, if people are wanting mediation, they're usually reassured by it because it's structured in a way which ensures that everybody gets listened to and that people are respectful towards each other and that they're able to create an outcome that works for them. So that's the second thing, to explain what a joint mediation meeting involves. And then thirdly, and this is quite unusual in the mediation world, I guess, in that what we talk about is what people might do if there isn't a joint mediation meeting, because the point of the process is that it's voluntary, and it's quite possible that either the person I'm meeting doesn't want to go ahead with the joint mediation meeting, or the other person doesn't want to. So rather than kind of just keep our fingers crossed and hope that it does go ahead, what we do is kind of treat the situation very realistically and say, so, what else might be possible if there isn't a joint mediation meeting? What might there be as other ways forward? How could you communicate with the other person about things if there isn't a joint mediation meeting? What might you be able to do to support yourself if there isn't a joint mediation meeting? Because the point is that if everything hangs on there being a joint mediation meeting as if it just can't be resolved without it, that's actually very unrealistic, because ultimately people will have the opportunity and capacity to resolve it, whether through mediation or otherwise. I mean, obviously mediation is designed to support that, and hopefully it can enable it to happen more quickly and more constructively, but at the end of the day it's not the only possible way in which a situation can be resolved. So what we do in the initial mediation meeting is talk through with people, what other ways might there be of things being resolved if there isn't a joint mediation meeting. And what this does is this serves a lot of positive purposes in that it makes it very clear that people are there because they want to be. They're not being cajoled into it, they're not being pushed into it, they're not being kind of sold a kind of a line by me as the mediator to try to persuade them they should take part. It's got to be their decision. But the thing that happens from it is that because they've started to think of ways forward, if they do actually come to a joint mediation meeting, they've already started to think of positive ways in which things can be improved. And if they don't go to a joint mediation meeting, what can sometimes happen is that they actually take steps that resolves the situation anyway. So it means that it's always focused on helping them to find a way forward, whether via a joint mediation meeting or otherwise. So the initial mediation meeting, this first meeting with each person individually, can actually be a very useful and supportive thing to happen. And interestingly, some approaches to mediation don't even have the initial mediation meeting. They just go straight to the joint meeting, and unfortunately sometimes the consequences of those seem to be that people turn up not really fully understanding what the meeting is going to be like, what its purpose is. And I sometimes hear mediators talk about their experiences when they don't do an initial mediation meeting, where they find the joint meeting quite disruptive and anarchic and not very cooperative, whereas the whole point of the initial mediation meeting is it means people are turning up excuse me, with a clear understanding of what the purpose of the meeting is, what the expectations of them are to conduct themselves appropriately, which is something I'll talk about when I look at the joint mediation meeting later, when I talk about the ground rules. I think I've talked about them already in the other videos, but I'll refer to them again in the joint mediation meeting. So the initial mediation meeting really helps to orientate people towards a creative, useful, cooperative, constructive outcome. And a lot of people who turn up initially at the initial mediation meeting thinking there's just no way that anything's going to go forward, often as a consequence of the initial mediation meeting feel much more confident that mediation can serve a useful purpose, whether a joint meeting happens or not. So that's the aim of the initial mediation meeting. One thing I kind of like to clarify is the approach isn't one where I would carry messages between the participants. The whole point of mediation, from my perspective, is that people take responsibility for whatever they need to do to resolve their difficulties. So I hear sometimes about situations where, because there's a concern that there might be difficult emotions in the joint meeting, that the mediator runs backwards and forwards between people carrying messages. Well, ultimately that doesn't really resolve anything, because people need to be able to move on from the mediation meeting to have an effective relationship if they're going to make any use of mediation at all. So if the mediator is running backwards and forwards between people, that's not supporting that, it's actually inhibiting it from going ahead. So if anybody were to want to come to chaos conflict management for mediation, it's not an approach where we would be running backwards and forwards between people carrying messages. What we do is we help you to find your own way of communicating with people. If that really does mean you don't want to sit in a room with people, with the other person, then what we do is try to help you think, well, how could you communicate with them? What other ways are there of communicating, which mean you don't have to sit in the room with them? But we wouldn't do that for you, because ultimately you've got to be able to communicate beyond the mediation process for yourself. And we see all people who participate in mediation as adults, and adults meaning that they're able to take responsibility for carrying things forward for themselves in the future. So yeah, that's pretty much in summary what the initial mediation meeting is for. It's, in a way, it's a preparation for the joint mediation meeting, but it's also serves a purpose in itself, in that it can help people to start thinking constructively about how they might be able to resolve things, whether they have a joint mediation meeting or not. So next section will be about the joint mediation meeting. So let's have a little break and we'll go into that after this. So on to the joint mediation meeting, which is much more structured than the initial mediation meeting. The initial mediation meeting is more like a conversation. It just kind of flows as a conversation, but the joint mediation meeting is much more structured, and with good reason, because it's designed to enable there to be progress through the meeting or through the discussion towards more effective communication and opportunities to be creative in the response to the conflict or the difficulty in some way. So the important thing from my point of view is that I'm creating a space in which people can listen to each other and create something different for themselves, different to what has previously occurred. So the way that we sometimes describe it is that I'm responsible as the mediator for the process, for the structure of the meeting and the rest of the meetings and the things that go on outside of that. But the participants are responsible for the content. They're responsible for what gets discussed, how it gets discussed, and what they create from it. So I have no part in that. I'm there to create a kind of a creative space for them in which they can help things to move forward. So the structure of the meeting is as follows, and there's some things which might kind of seem a little bit trivial in a way, but they actually serve a very important purpose. So one of them, at the very start of the meeting, is I just ask people how they'd like to be addressed in the meeting. And that's important because if people are going to sit in a room with each other for what could be up to about 3 hours, because each joint mediation meeting is usually between 2 and 3 hours in the model that I use, then obviously they want to feel comfortable with how they're being addressed during the meeting. So if they'd rather be called Mr. Johnson and people are calling them Paul, or vice versa, then they're not going to feel comfortable throughout. So a very simple thing at the start is just to establish how everybody would like to be addressed. So I'm Alan. How would this person like to be addressed? How would that person like to be addressed? And we establish that. The next thing I do is ask everybody present, whether it's 2 other people or more, to state very clearly that they're there with the intention of trying to resolve the dispute. So they can't guarantee they will resolve it, so it's about that they're there with the intention of trying to resolve the dispute or the difficulty or the conflict or whatever words are used to describe it. And it's important that people say that in each other's presence, because it's important that they all understand that they're there with that purpose. They're not there in order to try to kind of win against the other person, because mediation isn't about that. So if they are there for that purpose and they can't state openly that their aim is to try to resolve it, there's no point that's going forward. But it's a kind of a conscious statement, an outward statement that that is their intention, so that there's a sign that everybody's there in good faith for the rest of the meeting. The next thing I do is I establish what I've mentioned before, which is that there are 2 particular ground rules. I ask that people don't interrupt one another and that there's no abusive or offensive language or behaviour. So by that I mean abusive language, I mean, is where people, call someone a particular name. You're a beep, whatever name they call them. Um, and really for that, it's not because I've got any kind of problem with abusive language as such. It's just it doesn't fit with the original statement they've made that they're there to try to resolve things, and calling people abusive names doesn't serve that purpose. So if they're going to take responsibility for themselves, they commit to that ground rule. Also, as I say, that a behaviour as well will be things like I ask that people don't bang the table or point at each other. And the thing is, in the meeting, sometimes it might be that any of these things might happen just once or twice, just because people are in perhaps a kind of an anxious state or an angry state or an emotional state in some sense. But what matters is it doesn't keep happening. Once, maybe twice, we can just kind of refer to and ask for it not to continue. But if it keeps happening, it's a sign that the person isn't really there with the intention that they've stated. So I would end the meeting, because there's no purpose in us going forward if that were to happen. Having said that, I've never ever, in all 23 years of my mediating, ever had to end a meeting for that basis. And I see that as being because people have understood from the initial mediation meeting what its purpose is, and that there are these ground rules to ensure that that kind of thing doesn't happen. So I see that as being about people trusting and understanding the purpose of the mediation meeting. But there's no question I would end it if someone continued to do that. But as I say, it's never happened. So the next section of the joint mediation meeting is what's called uninterrupted time. And uninterrupted time is where each person gets an opportunity to say what they feel is important to address in the meeting. So it's for them to kind of say the things that have upset them, the things that they want to discuss, the things that they want to move forward from, the things that they're angry about, upset by, saddened by, feeling bullied about, whatever it is. But it's their opportunity to kind of say, with complete freedom to say it without any interruption, no comments at any time, all the things that they feel are important to say. And I don't set a time limit for that. I know some mediators do sometimes set a time limit. I'd be concerned about that, because I wouldn't want people to kind of be worrying that they couldn't say all the things that they want to. And I've never found that people talk for any extended length of time, so I'm happy not to set a time limit. And when they've finished, I will be taking notes while they're doing that. And when they've finished, I'll summarise back to them what they've said in their words, as I've explained in previous videos about why I do it that way. And that gives them a chance to reflect on what they've said, to hear what they've said, and to change or adjust anything or correct anything that I've misheard if I have. But it gives them a chance to feel really clear that they've said all the things that are important to them, so they're kind of out on the table, so to speak, and they feel clear that everything they need to say has been said. It doesn't mean they can't bring up other things later, because something else might come to them, but it gives them a chance to really be clear that they've had a chance to say all the things they feel are important to address in the meeting. It then happens for the other person or people as well, so everybody gets that opportunity. And so what that means is that perhaps the first hour of the meeting, possibly longer, it just depends, will be taken up with just listening to each other. That's it, no discussion at that point, just listening to each other. And as I say, the point of that being that people are clear that they are being listened to, because often in most disputes that's immediately one of the problems. People start to say something and someone cuts them off, or cuts across them, or argues with them, or tells them they're wrong. But this is where they can just say it without any interruption, without any contradiction, any argument. They are able to say all the things they feel are important. And the other person gets a chance to hear that without any interruption as well. So when everybody's had that opportunity, what it means is that they're all clear about what they're all there for, or they've had a chance to become more clear than perhaps they were in the past. And in itself, just that part of the meeting can sometimes make an enormous difference to people's understandings of each other. I've seen some meetings where actually that was all that was needed. They very quickly went to a resolution because they realised they misunderstood each other. But obviously that doesn't often happen, but I have seen that happen. So the next step is for people, based on what they've just heard and what they've just said, to clarify what for each of them are the key issues So they're kind of headlines for things to discuss in the next stage of the meeting, which is the main discussion. So they'll outline the things, the kind of headlines of the things that they may feel they want to talk about. So it might be, the other person's behaviour, a particular thing that happened, the way that someone's been speaking to them, whichever they are. But they'll list them. It doesn't become an agenda like in some meetings where you deal with one at a time. It's just them getting a chance to say what they feel are the important issues that they need to discuss. And that gives me a chance to have something to refer to later in the meeting to see how they feel about the different things that they've raised, to see whether they feel that they've been addressed, and if not, what would help that to happen. So it's a list which, sometimes can be anywhere between 3 things and 9 things or 10 things to look at. But once that's happened, then all I say to them is, so which one do you want to start with? And they may agree or disagree on which one to start with. That doesn't matter. That's for them to decide. But eventually, obviously, one gets started on, and it may be that it quickly moves on to a different one, or it may be that they focus on that one for quite some time. It really doesn't matter then. It's their discussion from that point onwards. And my role then is just to simply help the discussion to continue in a way that's always geared towards moving forward, always geared towards creating a different way forward in the situation. So if they seem to be stuck on something, I might ask them, so, this is something that so far you haven't been able to kind of come to any kind of shared view on, or understanding or agreement on. What would help that to happen? What is it you're both wanting to be different in the future that means that this is going to move on for you? But ultimately, one of the things I sometimes say on a training course is my role in the main discussion is to become invisible, to become irrelevant to their discussion. So it's clear that they are the people who are creating that way forward. They're the ones who are creating their answers. I'm not needed for them to have that conversation. And sometimes that in itself can be very significant for people, that they are able to see that they can have a conversation that's constructive and useful, whereas in the past they thought they couldn't. So, but I will come in to summarise sometimes, particularly early on in the discussion, summarise things that they've said, summarise things that maybe they've agreed on, or summarise things that they've come to a mutual understanding about. But that's in order just to help them to continue with their discussion towards ways forward. And as I've said before, at the end of the meeting or during the meeting, it may be that they want to write something down in agreement, but that's not a requirement. It may be that they just feel able to have kind of had a proper discussion about things and now understand each other better. There's no requirement for agreement, and it's no requirement that even if they do agree, it has to be written down. It's their decision. That's the most important thing. So sometimes if you have mediators who think they've got to get a written agreement in the meeting, it means they're actually becoming very intrusive in the discussion. They're becoming obstructive to it because their agenda is they've got to get something written down, and that may not be what the participants want. So my role is just to go with whatever they want. As long as they're clear they can have things written down if they want to, I don't then push that. And as I say, it then goes where it goes, and each mediation will be different. It will come to its own different outcomes, but the important thing is that people have had a substantial opportunity to have a discussion with each other about what it is that's been a problem. In the past, they may not have had more than 5 to 10 minutes to discuss things. This has been 2 to 3 hours of discussing things, so they can really go into the detail of why it's been a problem, what they'd want to be different, making proposals to each other, maybe not having those proposals accepted, but then looking at what would work instead, etc., etc. Whatever it is, it's always about focusing on finding a better way forward in the situation. So that's, I can't think much more to add to that really. That's very much how the meeting is structured and the reasons why it's done in the way that it's done. Sometimes people might want a second joint mediation meeting, and usually that's possible unless there's some kind of financial reason why maybe the commissioning organisation won't agree to that. But usually that's possible, so there can sometimes be a second joint mediation meeting. But I've never known there to be a request for, once I've known there to be a request for a third joint mediation meeting. Because if you think about the fact that people, by the time they've had 2, they will have had 6 hours of actually having a discussion with each other. So that's a very significant amount of time to have really looked at a problem and worked its way through. So usually by the end of one meeting, and if not certainly by the end of two, which rarely last the full 3 hours to be honest, people have had a substantial opportunity to really work constructively towards a better way forward. And as I've mentioned before, this isn't about people becoming friends. It's not about saying, oh, they've got to be happy clappy at the end. It's about working on the problem that has existed between them. So it's not saying they've got to be friends. Sometimes people do find that they like each other more than they thought as a consequence, but that's not what it's about. It's about creating a resolution of the problem, whatever that problem is. And that's the purpose of mediation. That's what it's all about. So yeah, that's it. I'll end it there. I hope you found that useful as well. If you do like what you've heard, as I've said before, please like the video now, just on the button down below, which I think will be there. Leave any comments or questions that you have, or requests for future videos if you have any. Please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear about more videos in the future. And other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you found the 3 videos, if you've seen all 3, to be very useful. And also that you like any of the other videos on the channel. Please check the channel out and see if there are other videos that you feel might be of interest to you. So thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.